Welcome to History 111, Lecture 20, Political Realignment. Although George Washington himself did not belong to a political party and was opposed to the very idea, during his presidency, the roots of the first party system emerged anyway, and the party system at this point is divided between Federalists and Democrat Republicans. The Federalists, their main leader was John Adams, and they tended to be pro-British, pro-business, and urban. Whereas the Democrat Republicans, who are known by a lot of other names, including Democrats, Republicans, and Jeffersonians, well, they tend to represent rural yeoman farmers. And a yeoman farmer is kind of a middle class, landed gentry sort of a farmer. So you have a rural urban divide, and you have one party representing basically the middle class, and one party representing the upper middle class and upper class. Now, during this time when political parties are starting to emerge, other important patterns are starting to come into place. And one of them has been nicknamed the Virginia Dynasty. And that's based on the fact that 4 of the first 5 presidents were all from Virginia. It's the largest state by population. It has a lot of individuals. In addition, all of these people that were part of this Virginia dynasty were founding fathers. And again, remember, when it comes to the Constitutional Convention, Virginia sent the most people, sent some of the biggest and best people. So there's really this Virginia domination of the government. And the last important pattern was 3 of the first 5 presidents had all been Secretary of State before becoming president. Now keep in mind that the 2 who weren't were George Washington, who was the first president, and there was no Secretary of State before that, so he could have not done that, and the second president was John Adams, who had served as vice president under Washington. So once we get past Adams, everybody else has been Secretary of State first. The vice president is not seen as a natural successor at this time, and isn't even necessarily of the same party. And Aaron Burr is a really good example of a vice president that nobody really wants to step in and replace the sitting president. Now, this whole system persists for a while, but the Federalist Party was really crippled by the failures to bring the idea of secession forward, and the Hartford Convention and things like that, and the fact that the time period right after the War of 1812 has been nicknamed the era of good feelings. People were really generally happy in the country. So the Federalist Party doesn't have much of a platform left. Now, the last vestiges of the party are going to hang on until 1828, but it's basically dead at this point. The Federalists do not have a presidential candidate in 1816. In 1820, James Monroe is going to run unopposed for president. And so what we're seeing is there's just a lack of political opposition. Now, Monroe, however, is going to make a conscious effort to bridge party divides, and the idea is going to be to get a representation of all American views. So Monroe is going to appoint cabinet members from all over the country and for different political factions, and he really wants to have an inclusive government. Now, what he's going to do that's very important is he's going to appoint a New Englander, John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State. And what's really important about that is that he is now the obvious successor, and that's going to signal the end of the Virginia dynasty. Everyone at this point knows that the job you do to become ready to become president is Secretary of State. So basically, Monroe is saying, hey, the next guy ought to be from the North. Now, after James Madison, one really important thing is going to change, which is the caucus system is going to come to an end. Now, presidential candidates at this point have been selected by meetings of the elected leaders of the 2 parties. But in 1824, candidates are going to be put forward by state legislatures and mass meetings throughout the country. And a second party system is going to emerge out of divides in the Democrat-Republican camp. And the split is going to become both regional, and it's going to really revolve around people who love Andrew Jackson and people who completely hate Andrew Jackson. When we get to the 1824 election, James Monroe decides not to seek a 3rd term. At this point, 2 terms is a tradition, and every president has served 2 terms except Adams, who only served 1. In addition, Monroe is otherwise occupied. Lafayette is returning to the United States as a guest and is going to tour the country for the 50th anniversary of the Revolution. And Monroe is going to die shortly after, and he's going to die broke. He's got major economic problems, and he ends up having to donate his plantations, and they become part of the campus of UVA and William Mary colleges. And for the most part, Monroe just kind of bows out of American politics right at the time of the election. So the nominations for president becomes basically a free-for-all because the party system is broken down. So the official Democrat-Republican endorsement goes to a man named William Crawford. But what happens is it ends up being a 4-way presidential race anyway. Now, the election results aren't clear because all you have is 4 candidates. Andrew Jackson, a general, gets 99 votes. 84 votes go to John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State. 41 to Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury, and 37 to Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. Now, what you have is You have no clear winner. Nobody had more than 50%. Now, when this happens, the Constitution says what we're supposed to do. The Constitution says that the House of Representatives will elect the president by a majority vote. And Congress may vote for any of the top three candidates, that they're entitled to choose from anyone on that list. What that means is Henry Clay is out of the running, but Congress is entitled to choose from any of the other three candidates. So what happens next is a conflict between what's going to rationally happen and what people feel ought to happen. Now, what's going to happen rationally is the supporters of Adams and Jackson are going to continue to support their candidate, whereas Crawford supporters are going to see they can't win, and they're going to go to their next choice. They're going to either support Adams or Jackson, depending on what they prefer. Now, Clay's supporters are also going to do the same thing, but they're not going to vote for Crawford. And they're going to go ahead and either vote for Adams or Jackson. Now, if we assume that everybody is going to act rationally, support their interests, what happens is the tendency is for the supporters of a lesser candidate to align against the front runner. Because here's the thing, if they had wanted Andrew Jackson, they would have voted for him in the first place. Now, what that means is, since they don't want Andrew Jackson, they're going to align around what they see as the best alternative, and that's going to be John Quincy Adams. That's what happens. But people feel that Jackson ought to be the winner since he had the most votes. Even though he didn't have the majority, he still had the most, so people feel like he's entitled to it. And then everything plays out in that situation. Henry Clay backs Adams in the House election. Crawford is seriously ill and not seen as viable anyway, so he completely bows out. And what that means is that Adams gets enough votes to become the president. Then the last piece falls into place. Henry Clay is appointed Secretary of State, and people believe that some type of dirty deal was cut, and they nickname it the corrupt bargain. And what they allege is that Adams bought Clay off with promise of an office. And remember, the pattern of the Secretary of State becoming the next president is very strong in American politics. So what they basically believe is that Adams promised Clay that if Clay got him the votes, Clay could become the next president after him. Now, the charges of corruption are going to cause a general lack of support for Adams as president, and Jacksonians are going to block almost every effort of his administration. And one of the other things that's really going to harm him as president is the loss of support that follows what's called the Tariff of Abominations. Now, this tariff was intended to help New England textile industries who were suffering from British dumping of textiles and driving market prices down. Now, to get this tariff through, a lot of other duties had to be added. In modern terms, it's called pork barreling. Basically, every congressman demanded something for their constituents before they would vote for the bill, and this leads to this horrible mess of taxes that really angers the South and ultimately leads to something called the nullification crisis that we're going to talk about a bit later. So the second party system emerges, and it emerges out of a shift in the political divide from merchants and industry versus planners to Adams versus Jackson. So the National Republicans rally around Adams, and a lot of them were ex-Federalists who had joined the Democrat Republicans, and they worked on a platform of economic nationalism. In other words, they were pro-business. Now, the pro-Jackson faction takes the name Democrats, and they call for a widening of economic opportunity and for what they call an assault of economic opportunity. In other words, they want more options for the common man, and it becomes more of a rich versus poor than an urban rich middle class versus rural rich and middle class. Now, this also has a strong regional element, but it really becomes a rich poor, a common man elite type of a thing. Now, Jackson is going to win a decisive victory in 1828, making John Quincy Adams also a one-term president, and it's going to split along regional lines with New England backing Adams and basically everywhere else backing Jackson. So what's the big idea? In the beginning, it was the Federalists and the Democrats, with the Federalists ultimately failing. Now, Monroe's going to come in, he's going to try to bridge the gap and end the Virginia dynasty and kind of reunite all the political factions, but a new split emerges with Adams and Jackson. And what that does is it takes the big political divide in the country from rural and urban and makes it more about rich and poor. See you in the next lecture.